Imagine a man standing in the twilight of the Appalachian and the buckshot tears through the air, striking him square in the face. But the man doesn't fall. He doesn't even scream. He simply spits the lead pellets onto the ground as if they were cherry pits, a cold grin spreading across his face. This wasn't a scene from a movie. This was the reality for those who dared to cross Tally Iron Jaws Hall. The whispers in Wise County said he was more than a man. They said he was enchanted, that bullets couldn't kill him. But was he a demon born of mountain folklore? Or was the truth something far stranger, something hidden in the very marrow of his bones? Today, we separate the legend from the man to find out what really made Tally Hall the bandit who couldn't be killed. To understand the man, you must first understand the mountains that made him. In the late 19th century, Wise County, Virginia, was a world unto itself. It was a labyrinth of steep hollows, dense forests, and rushing creeks where the outside world felt a million miles away. The land was both a provider and a tyrant. It gave families corn from the bottomlands and game from the woods, but it demanded backbreaking work in return. Life here was simple, hard, and governed by unwritten laws older than any courthouse. Family was everything, and an insult to your kin was an insult to you. In this world, Mabra Tally Hall was born. He wasn't born a monster or a legend. He was just another mountain boy, learning the ways of his people. And in these parts, the most important craft, the very lifeblood of the local economy, was turning corn into whiskey. Moonshining wasn't seen as a crime by many. It was a tradition, a skill passed from father to son. It was how you turned a surplus crop into cash, how you paid for medicine, tools, or a piece of land to call your own. Tally learned the trade early, mastering the art of the still, understanding the subtle science of fermentation and distillation under the dark Appalachian night. He was a big man, powerfully built from a life of hard labor. People knew him as strong, quiet, and fiercely protective of his own. He worked his still, provided for his family, and lived by the mountain code. In these early days, he was just a distiller, respected for the quality of his product. He was part of a community of others just like him, men who saw the federal government's whiskey tax not as a law to be obeyed, but as an intrusion by a foreign power trying to steal the bread from their tables. The conflict wasn't just about money, it was about pride and independence. The people of these mountains had always taken care of themselves. They built their own homes, grew their own food, and settled their own disputes. The arrival of federal marshals, the revenuers, was seen as a declaration of war on their entire way of life. These outsiders didn't understand the mountains or the people who lived in them. They saw moonshiners as simple criminals, not as farmers and family men trying to survive. And in this simmering tension, the seeds of Tally Hall's future were sown. He wasn't just making whiskey, he was making a stand. Every barrel he sold was an act of defiance. But this quiet rebellion couldn't last forever. The government was determined to enforce its laws, and men like Tally were just as determined to resist. The calm of the mountains was about to be shattered by the crack of rifles, and a simple moonshiner named Tally Hall would soon be forced to become something far more dangerous to survive. The world was coming for him, and it would learn that he would not be taken easily. The law came for Tally Hall not with a polite knock, but with the splintering of wood and the cold gleam of rifle barrels. It happened on a misty morning, deep in a holler where the smell of sour mash hung heavy in the air. Tally was working his still with his brother when two federal marshals, led by a man named Red Blevins, crashed through the undergrowth. They weren't there to talk, they were there to make an example. With a sneer, Blevins kicked over a barrel of fermenting corn, the lifeblood of the Hall family business spilling into the dirt. For a mountain man, this was more than the destruction of property. It was a profound insult, a strike against his pride and his ability to provide. Tally stood frozen for a moment, his massive hands clenched into fists. He didn't say a word. According to the stories passed down, Marshal Blevins then raised his axe, not to the still itself, but to the worm, the delicate copper coil that was the heart of the operation. As the axe came down, something inside Tarley Hall snapped. The quiet distiller was gone, and in his place stood something far more primal. What happened next became the first chapter of his legend. Tarley didn't reach for a gun. He lunged forward, moving with a speed that was terrifying in a man his size. He met the marshals not with bullets, but with bone and sinew. He broke one man's arm with a single brutal twist and sent the other flying with a blow to the chest that knocked the wind clean out of him. Red Blevins, the leader, found himself lifted off the ground by his throat, staring into eyes that held no mercy. Tarley didn't kill him. He simply threw him down the hillside like a sack of grain, leaving him broken and humiliated. The marshals limped back to the town of Wise, carrying with them not just bruises and broken bones, but a story of a man who fought like a cornered bear. The line had been crossed. This was no longer about an unpaid tax. Tarley Hall had assaulted federal officers. A warrant was issued for his arrest, and his name was no longer just whispered among moonshiners. It was now spoken with fear and anger in the courthouse. He was officially a fugitive, a wanted man with a price on his head. Tarley knew what this meant. There was no going back. He couldn't return to a quiet life. He had stood his ground, and now the full weight of the law was coming for him. But instead of running, he dug in. He gathered his brothers and his kin, men who believed in the same code he did. The forest that had been his workshop now became his fortress. The first drops of blood had been shed, not by Tarley, but by the government's attempt to break him. And Tarley Hall had answered in the only language he knew they would understand. The war had begun. With a price on his head, Tarley Hall became the most hunted man in Wise County. But hunting him and catching him were two very different things. The mountains were his kingdom, and he moved through them like a ghost. This drove his rivals, other moonshiners whose business he had crushed with his own brand of violent enforcement, to a point of desperation. They decided to do what the law couldn't. They set a trap on the Pound Gap, a treacherous road that snaked through the mountains, a place where a man could disappear without a trace. They waited in the deep shadows as Tarley rode alone, a silhouette against the rising moon. As he passed a narrow bend, the night erupted. A shotgun blast, fired from less than 20 feet away, struck him full in the head and upper body. The sound echoed through the holler, a deafening roar that sent birds scattering from the trees. Tarley's horse shrieked and crumpled to the ground, its legs tangled in a dying heap. The ambushers stepped out from their cover, rifles ready, expecting to see a body. But Tarley Hall was still standing. He swayed on his feet, stunned by the impact, but he did not fall. The men watched in frozen disbelief as he slowly raised a hand to his face. There was a strange, gravelly sound, and then he spat something dark onto a broadleaf plant on the roadside. He did it again and again. The moonlight caught the objects, and the attackers felt a cold dread creep up their spines. They were lead pellets. Buckshot. He was spitting the bullets out of his own flesh. It was in this moment that the man died, and the legend was born. The attackers weren't looking at a moonshiner anymore. They were looking at something torn from the pages of a dark folk tale, a creature the mountains themselves had made. He took a step towards them, his face a mask of cold fury. One of the men, shaking with fear, raised his rifle and fired again. The bullet slammed into Tarley's chest with a sickening thud, a sound like a hammer hitting stone. It barely staggered him. The sounds that followed were not of gunfire. They were the sounds of snapping wood as Tarley ripped a rifle from one man's hands and broke it over his knee like a twig. They were the dull, heavy thuds of fists meeting flesh, followed by choked-off cries of pain. He didn't use a gun. He didn't need to. He moved among them like a storm, and when the terrible, frantic noise was over, only silence remained. He left the men broken and scattered on that lonely road, a living testament to his unnatural resilience. From that night on, he was no longer just Tally Hall. He was Iron Jaws Hall. The story spread like wildfire, carried on hushed whispers from one holler to the next. They said he was protected by a witch, that he had made a pact with the devil. The truth, doctors would speculate many years later, may have been a rare medical condition called Paget's disease, which causes bones to become abnormally thick and dense, essentially creating a form of natural armor. But in the dark woods of Wise County, no one cared about a medical diagnosis. The only truth that mattered was the one they saw with their own eyes and heard in the terrified tales of the survivors. Tally Hall was enchanted. He was bulletproof, and if you shot him, you had better pray you killed him with the first shot, because you would not get a second. The silence that fell over Pound Gap after the failed ambush was deeper and more terrifying than the roar of the shotgun that had started it. The broken men who dragged themselves back to civilization did not speak of a botched attack. They spoke of a nightmare. They told a story not of a fight, but of an encounter with something inhuman, something that ate lead and paid it back with crushing force. Their words, laced with genuine terror, were far more potent than any rumor. The legend of Iron Jaws Hall was no longer a whispered bit of folklore. It was now a sworn testimony, sealed in fear. Tally Hall himself seemed to understand the power of what had happened. He didn't retreat deeper into the mountains. Instead, he did the opposite. He became more visible, more brazen. He knew that fear was a more effective weapon than any rifle. His reputation preceded him, a silent, invisible guard that cleared his path. Other moonshiners, men who had once been his rivals, now fell in line. They either paid him a tribute to operate, a tax of their own, or they got out of the business entirely. To defy Tally was to challenge a man who bullets supposedly couldn't harm. No one was willing to take that chance. The authorities were now faced with an impossible situation. The reward for Tally's capture was increased, becoming a small fortune for the time. But money meant nothing against superstition. Deputies who were brave enough to face a dozen armed men would hesitate at the thought of confronting Tally Hall alone. Informants dried up, their fear of the law replaced by a much more primal fear of Iron Jaws. The manhunt, once an active pursuit, became a cold case file gathering dust on a shelf. They were hunting a ghost who was very much alive, a man who ruled a shadow empire from the heart of their jurisdiction. The community became a landscape of fear and fascination. On one hand, Tally was a boogeyman. People would lock their doors a little tighter at night, and his name was used to frighten misbehaving children. He was the embodiment of the violence and lawlessness that festered in the deep woods. But on the other hand, a quiet, grudging respect grew for him in some corners. He was a mountain man, one of their own, who was single-handedly defying the federal government and winning. He was a symbol, however dark, of Appalachian grit and refusal to bow down. The ashes of that ambush on Pound Gap were not from a fire, but from the smouldering ruin of Tally Hall's mortality. What was left was a silence born of pure dread. He had become the undisputed king of the Wise County underworld, not just a criminal, but a living legend whose power was rooted in the belief that he could not be killed by ordinary means. The law was powerless, his rivals were terrified, and Tally Iron Jaws Hall walked the mountains not as a fugitive, but as a conqueror. Tally Iron Jaws Hall never stood trial in a courthouse. He was never made to sit on a hard wooden bench and listen to lawyers argue over his fate. The law of men, with its warrants, judges and juries, proved utterly powerless against him. His trial was a rolling, years-long affair, held in the dark hollows and on the treacherous mountain roads. The prosecuting attorneys were the bounty hunters and federal marshals who came for him, and the evidence they presented was the buckshot and rifle slugs they fired his way. The bounty on his head grew to be a legendary sum, drawing daring men from neighboring states. They came with new rifles and hardened resolve, dreaming of the fame and fortune that would come from bringing in Iron Jaw's haul. They formed posses, laid intricate traps, and combed the mountains, convinced they would succeed where others had failed. They were, in effect, a travelling court, come to Wise County to deliver a sentence. But Taylor Hall was his own defense attorney, and his arguments were brutally effective. One by one, the posses were outsmarted, the traps were sidestepped, and the bounty hunters were met with a terrifying response. Some were found beaten near to death, left as a warning on the side of a road. Others simply vanished into the woods, never to be seen again. The verdict in each of these violent encounters was the same. Taylor Hall walked away. He was judged by the laws of survival, and in that court he was consistently found innocent by virtue of being the last man standing. This was not justice, it was dominance. Taylor had replaced the law of the land with his own law of fear. But the justice of the mountains is a patient, cruel thing. For every man he intimidated, he created an enemy. For every family he terrorized, he sowed the seeds of a future reckoning. His invincibility had made him arrogant, and he had forgotten the most fundamental rule of his world. There is always someone tougher, someone more desperate, or someone with a better aim. The final trial came without warning. A lawman, some say a deputy named Doc Swindle, decided the only way to stop a legend was to meet it head-on. He didn't come with a warrant. He came with a rifle and a resolve as hard as the mountain stone. He hunted Taylor not as a lawman pursuing a criminal, but as a predator stalking its prey. He found him on a lonely path, and there was no talk, no chance to surrender. The air cracked with the sound of a single, well-aimed shot. This time, Iron Jaws fell. He hit the dirt, and this time he did not get back up. The bullet, they say, was special. Some claim it was silver, others that it was filled with mercury, designed to overcome whatever magic protected him. But whether it was magic or lead, the verdict was finally in. Taylor Hall was guilty, and the sentence was death. It was a verdict delivered not by a jury, but by a lone gunman, and it raises the ultimate question. Was this the law of men at last catching its fugitive? Or was it simply the brutal, unforgiving justice of the mountains finally claiming one of its own? Taylor Iron Jaws Hall was buried in a small, remote cemetery in Wise County, not far from the lands he once ruled. For years, his grave was marked only by a simple fieldstone, as if even in death, people were afraid to carve his name for fear of what it might conjure. Today, a more formal headstone stands, a silent testament to the man who was once a living terror. Local historians and descendants still visit, standing over the patch of earth that finally managed to hold him, and they wonder. The physical landscape has changed. Pound Gap is no longer a treacherous dirt track, but a paved highway, US Route 23, that carries thousands of cars a day. Commuters and truckers speed through the cut in the mountain, their minds on schedules and destinations, completely unaware that they are passing through the very spot where a man once stood and spat buckshot back at his would-be killers. But for those who know the story, a drive through the gap, especially as evening falls, feels different. The shadows seem deeper, and the wind whistling through the rocks sounds like a whisper from the past. The legend of Iron Jaws has outlived the man by more than a century. It survives in the oral traditions of Appalachia, a story told by grandparents to their grandchildren, a campfire tale that happens to be true. While modern science offers a plausible explanation in the form of Paget's disease, that dry medical term has none of the power or romance of the legend. In the mountains, the story of the enchanted moonshiner who couldn't be killed by bullets remains the preferred version. It speaks to a deeper truth about the region, a belief in the extraordinary, and a deep-seated suspicion of simple explanations. The name Hall still echoes through Wise County and the surrounding region. The descendants carry not just the name, but the complex legacy of their infamous ancestor. For some, it's a dark chapter best forgotten, a stain of violence on the family history. For others, it's a source of a strange, defiant pride, a reminder of an ancestor who refused to bow to anyone, who was a king in his own right, however brutal his reign. The story hasn't vanished. It's simply gone underground, living on in family Bibles and hushed conversations. The mountains remember everything, and the shadow of Tali Iron Jaws Hall is a long one. So we come back to the question that hung in the air at the start of our journey. Was Tali Iron Jaws Hall truly enchanted by bullets? The logical mind points to science, to the rare bone disease that likely turned his skull and ribs into a natural, horrifying armor. And perhaps that is the simple, factual truth. But in the mountains, the truth is rarely simple. The real magic wasn't in his bones, it was in the power of belief. His legend became a weapon more potent than any gun, a shield more effective than any steel plate. The fear he created was so real, so absolute, that it may as well have been a genuine enchantment. This is a story that goes beyond a simple tale of a mountain outlaw. It is a raw and brutal lesson about the soul of Appalachia itself. It's a story about the fierce, untamable spirit of independence, but also a dark warning of what that spirit can become when it's stripped of its humanity. Tali Hall began as a man defending his way of life, a symbol of resistance against an outside world he didn't trust. But in his war against the law, he became a tyrant far more terrifying than any government agent, a monster who preyed on his own people. He is the ultimate Appalachian paradox, a folk hero and a villain forged in the same fire. The story of Iron Jaws teaches us that some legends are born not from fantasy, but from a truth so strange it has to be seen to be believed. He was a man of flesh and blood, but he became something more, an idea, a nightmare, a force of nature. Force. He walked the earth for a time, a king in a kingdom of shadows and fear, until the mountains that created him finally took him back. His name is now a whisper on the wind, a reminder that the old, wild magic of these hills has not entirely faded. And now, my friends, you know the rest of the story. In the mountains of Harlan County, Kentucky, there came a time when the law was not your friend. It was a hired gun, a time when a union card was a death warrant, and children learned to sleep on the floor to dodge the bullets fired through their bedroom walls in the dead of night. The outside world called it a labor dispute, but for the people living it, it was a war. A war so brutal that its anthem was not just a song, but a desperate question. Which side are you on? Today, we descend into the darkness of bloody Harlan to tell the story of the decade-long battle that forced every man, woman, and child to choose. To understand the war, you first have to understand the world that was lost, and the men who were pushed until they had nothing left to lose. Before the bullets flew, there was the quiet desperation of the company town. Imagine a world sealed off by ancient mountains, a place where the coal company wasn't just your employer, it was your landlord, your grocer, your government, and your god. You lived in a company house, a flimsy shack perched on a hillside, often without running water, that could be taken from you at a moment's notice. Your children were born with company doctors, and you bought their food at the company store. But you didn't use real money. You used scrip, a private currency that was worthless anywhere else, and the prices were always inflated. This was a system designed for debt, a set of invisible chains that tethered you and your family to the mine. Every day you went deeper into the hole, both literally and financially. Your life, from cradle to grave, was mortgaged to King Coal, and the work itself was a daily descent into hell. Deep beneath the beautiful green hills, men crawled on their bellies in the dark, breathing in the fine black dust that would one day choke the life from their lungs. They gambled every shift against the black damp, a pocket of unbreathable gas that could suffocate you in an instant, or the ever-present threat of a roof collapse that could bury you alive. For clawing the wealth of the nation from the earth's guts, they were paid pennies. These weren't just workers. They were fathers, husbands, and sons. They were proud mountain folk whose families had lived on this land for generations. Their dreams were simple: a small plot of land to call their own, shoes for their children, and the dignity of a fair day's pay for a deadly day's work. They were men who understood hardship, who accepted the risks of the mine as a fact of life. They were patient, they were resilient, and they were quiet. But then the Great Depression hit, and the coal operators in Harlan, in a final act of desperation and greed, slashed the miners' wages to a level that was no longer survivable. It was the final turn of the screw on a people already pressed to their limits. This wasn't just an insult. It was a death sentence delivered by starvation. And in that moment, the quiet patience that had defined these men for generations began to curdle into a cold, hard rage. The mountains themselves seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the spark that would ignite the powder keg. By the spring of 1931, the whispers had turned into a low growl that echoed through the hollows. The United Mine Workers had arrived, and with them, a flicker of hope that terrified the coal operators. For every man who signed a union card, a family was thrown out of their home. For every secret meeting, a union man was beaten on a dark road. The law, in the form of Sheriff J.H. Blair and his army of deputized thugs, was no longer a shield for the people. It was a hammer for the companies. The crime scene wasn't a single place. The entire county was becoming one, primed for an explosion. That explosion came on May the 5th in a narrow pass near the town of Evarts. The scene itself was deceptively peaceful. A dusty road winding between two steep, wooded hillsides, a natural choke point. On any other day, it was a place of quiet Appalachian beauty. But on this day, the trees weren't just trees, they were hiding places. The silence wasn't peace, it was the tense, held breath before a storm. On those hillsides, miners lay waiting, their squirrel rifles and old shotguns clutched in their hands. They were men who had been hunted, and now they had become the hunters. When the shooting finally stopped, a new kind of silence fell over the pass. A heavy, ringing silence, punctuated by the groans of the wounded. The scene left for the authorities was one of utter chaos. 3 company cars, riddled with bullet holes, sat stalled on the road. The dust was littered with a confusing mix of shell casings, the heavy brass of the deputies' machine guns, and the simple spent shells from the miners' hunting rifles. Blood stained the dirt road, a testament to the ferocity of the 15-minute battle. The immediate evidence told a terrifying story, but offered no easy answers. 3 deputies and 1 miner were dead. The official report would call it a cold-blooded ambush, an act of insurrection by lawless miners. But the miners would whisper a different tale, one of self-defense, of a motorcade of gun thugs on their way to shoot up another picket line, of a people who finally decided to shoot back. The tracks leading away from the road vanished into the dense woods, swallowed by a wilderness that knew how to keep its secrets. The Battle of Evarts left behind more than bodies and brass. It left behind a bone-chilling question that hung in the smoke-filled air. This wasn't a simple murder. This was an organized, armed uprising. Who had planned it? Who gave the order to fire? The scene spoke of desperation and rage, but the wilderness offered no confessions. It only confirmed a terrible new reality. The war in Harlan County had gone hot, and the mountains themselves had become the first and most mysterious witness to the bloodshed. In the chaotic hours after the Battle of Evarts, as the bodies of the deputies were carried out of the pass, Sheriff J.H. Blair didn't need a detective to find his prime suspects. He already had his culprits. For months, a clear and public enemy had been challenging his authority and the absolute power of the coal operators. The finger of blame pointed squarely, and without a moment's hesitation, at the organizers of the United Mine Workers of America. These were the men who had come into his county preaching a gospel of discontent. They were, in the eyes of the establishment, outside agitators with foreign ideas about collective bargaining and workers' rights. They held secret meetings in darkened schoolhouses and on remote hillsides, whispering promises of a better life into the ears of desperate men. They were the ones who had lit the fuse of rebellion, and in the minds of the company men, the explosion at Evarts was the inevitable result. Their motive seemed undeniable. For weeks, Blair's deputies had been systematically breaking the strike, beating organizers and evicting families with brutal efficiency. The Union was losing. The ambush at Evarts wasn't just a random act of violence, it was a calculated message, a bloody declaration that the UMWA would not be crushed without a fight. It was a violent attempt to seize control of the county and to terrorize the law-abiding citizens and workers who had refused to join their cause. This wasn't a mystery. It was an open war, and the Union had just fired its deadliest shot. The evidence, as far as the law in Harlan was concerned, was self-evident. Every man on that hillside was either a Union member or a sympathizer. The Union had been advocating for resistance, and now resistance had turned deadly. Whispers immediately became official reports. Names of known Union leaders and the most outspoken miners were put on arrest warrants. The narrative was simple and powerful. The Union came, and then there was violence. Therefore, the Union was to blame. For Sheriff Blair, the case was already open and shut, and the manhunt for the Union men began immediately. But while Sheriff Blair's fury was aimed squarely at the Union men on the hills, a colder, more complicated suspicion began to take root behind the closed doors of the Coal Operators Association. The ambush at Evarts had been too perfect, too precise. The miners were desperate, yes, but this level of coordination suggested something more than just spontaneous rage. It suggested information. It suggested a leak, and a leak could only come from the inside. Suspicion, like a mountain mist, began to curl around the figures who stood between the two warring camps, the mine foreman and the company guards who had been deputized by Blair. These were men who came from mining families themselves, who spoke the same language and understood the grievances of the men in the pits, yet they drew their paychecks directly from the operators. They were trusted by both sides, and therefore trusted by neither. Could one of these men, a man who walked the line between loyalty and blood, have been the true architect of the massacre? The motive wouldn't have been a simple cry for workers' rights. It would have been something far more personal and venomous. Imagine a foreman whose father had been killed in a roof collapse years earlier, a death ruled an accident, but always whispered to have been caused by company negligence. He had risen through the ranks, his loyalty a perfect mask for a patient, simmering hatred. For a man like that, the Union wasn't a cause, it was a weapon. Looking back, the signs were there. One particular foreman, known for his harsh discipline, had been conspicuously absent from the convoy that day, claiming a sudden illness. In the aftermath, his grief seemed hollow, his questions to the other deputies sharp, not with sorrow, but with the careful precision of a man confirming the details of a plan gone right. He knew the convoy's route, their departure time, and their numbers. A single, anonymous tip to a Union contact was all it would have taken to turn that dusty road into a killing field, sacrificing a few of Blair's thugs to ignite a war that could burn his true enemies to the ground. The thought was chilling, that the Battle of Evarts wasn't an act of rebellion, but a calculated act of revenge, orchestrated by a traitor who wore the company's own badge. But there was a third shadow that fell across the mountains, one that terrified the Union and the operators alike. This wasn't a local feud. The Great Depression had set the entire nation on edge, and whispers of revolution were drifting out of the cities and into the forgotten hollows of Appalachia. This third suspect wasn't a man, but an idea, a radical, violent ideology that saw the struggle in Harlan not as a labor dispute, but as the first battleground in a new American Civil War. Agents of more extreme movements, men who found the United Mine Workers too tame, began to slip into the county. They weren't miners. They were professional organizers, hardened veterans of bloodier conflicts in other parts of the country. They spoke not of contracts and wage increases, but of seizing the mines and overthrowing the system entirely. They saw the miners' desperation not as a problem to be solved, but as fuel for a much larger fire. Their motive was pure and terrifyingly impersonal: chaos. For them, a negotiated peace was a failure. They needed martyrs. They needed headlines. They needed a war. The Battle of Evarts, with its shocking death toll, was a perfect victory in their eyes. It escalated the conflict beyond the point of no return, forcing the hand of both the Union and the state. It transformed a local strike into a national symbol of class warfare. Their presence was felt not in public speeches, but in the shadows. Strange pamphlets would appear in the mining camps overnight, calling for armed resistance. Seasoned men with city accents were seen in hushed conversations with the most desperate and angry of the young miners, teaching them not how to picket, but how to build a barricade, how to choose a location for an ambush. They were ghosts in the machine, whispering poison into the ears of men who were already half-mad with hunger and injustice. For these outsiders, the dead at Evarts were not a tragedy. They were a necessary sacrifice to ignite the revolution they craved. In the wake of the Battle of Evarts, Sheriff Blair's investigation was not a search for truth. It was a hunt for vengeance. He unleashed his army of deputies with a single simple objective: round up every known Union man and sympathizer. Warrants were issued for dozens of miners, but this wasn't a process of careful arrests. It was a brutal sweep. Doors were kicked in at midnight. Men were dragged from their beds in front of their screaming wives and children, their faces already bloodied by the time they were thrown into the back of a truck. But the mountains, which had served as a fortress for the coal operators, now became a sanctuary for the miners. The deputies, many of them outsiders themselves, were clumsy and loud in this terrain. They knew the roads, but the miners knew the land. Men vanished into the deep woods and winding hollows, swallowed whole by a wilderness that was loyal to its own. Posses would track a man for days, following a clear trail to the mouth of an abandoned mine or a remote cabin, only to find the trail had gone cold, as if the man they were chasing had simply turned to mist and drifted away on the wind. The few men they did manage to capture offered no clear answers. Under the brutal persuasion of a deputy's blackjack, stories changed and collapsed. Some men, desperate to stop the beating, would name anyone, spinning wild tales of a grand Union conspiracy led by organizers who were already long gone, having fled the state. Others, defiant to the end, would say nothing at all. The evidence Blair presented to the prosecutors was a tangled mess of coerced confessions and contradictory testimonies. The promise of a swift, clean conviction for the murder of his deputies evaporated into a fog of confusion and lies. The investigation was hitting a wall, and Blair's frustration festered into a more indiscriminate cruelty. Unable to catch the supposed ringleaders, his deputies turned their rage on the community at large. They would stop cars on lonely roads, not to ask questions, but to deliver beatings. They prowled the edges of the mining camps, their presence a constant, suffocating threat. The initial assumption that a few Union leaders were responsible was proving impossible to prove. The hunt for a specific culprit devolved into a general war on the mining population, and with every failed raid and fruitless interrogation, the fear in Harlan County grew deeper, and the truth buried itself a little further in the dark, silent earth. As Sheriff Blair's hunt intensified, his deputies slammed into a wall. It wasn't made of stone or wood, but of something far stronger, the absolute, unyielding silence of the mountain people. The louder the deputies shouted, the deeper the silence became. Questions were met with blank stares. Threats were answered with a shrug. Men who had worked side by side their whole lives, who knew every secret in the holler, suddenly saw nothing, heard nothing, and knew nothing. An invisible pact of silence, an omerta of the coal fields, had descended upon Harlan County. This silence was not born of ignorance, but of a cold, calculated understanding of survival. To speak to Sheriff Blair's men was not to help the cause of justice. It was to paint a target on your own front door. Everyone knew the price of talking. It meant a visit in the dead of night, the sound of heavy boots on your porch, a beating that left you unable to work for a week. It meant your wife and children being terrorized by gun thugs who would shine their headlights into your windows just to let you know they were watching. But the silence was also a matter of profound loyalty. In these isolated communities, blood and neighborly bonds were the only true law. The men on that hillside at Evarts were not abstract criminals. They were your cousin, your brother-in-law, the man who helped you rebuild your fence last spring. To turn against them was to turn against your own kin, to betray the only social fabric you had. The law of J.H. Blair was temporary and corrupt, but the judgment of your neighbors was forever. You would starve before you became a snitch. The psychological toll was immense, especially for those who might have been tempted to speak. Old man Hemphill, who lived on the road to Evarts, made the mistake of telling the postman he'd seen a car he didn't recognize parked near the pass the day before the shooting. It was an innocent remark, nothing more. A week later, he woke to find his family's milk cow, their only source of extra income, lying dead in his field with its throat cut. No one had to say a word. The message was understood by everyone in a 50-mile radius. After that, no one dared to even whisper about what they might have seen. The mountains had closed ranks, and the truth of what happened at Evarts was locked behind a wall of fear that no amount of force could ever break down. For years, the war in Harlan was a grinding stalemate of terror and endurance. The seasons changed, but the fear did not. The truth of the Battle of Evarts and the countless ambushes that followed seemed destined to be buried forever, lost to the wall of silence and the corruption of the law. The turning point, when it finally came, wasn't a dusty clue found in an old cabin or a deathbed confession whispered in the dark. It came from the outside world, in the form of men who carried briefcases instead of shotguns. In the mid-1930s, a United States Senate subcommittee, known as the La Follette Committee, began investigating violations of workers' rights across the country. And their gaze finally fell upon the dark and bloody ground of Harlan County. These men from Washington were a new kind of power, one that Sheriff Blair couldn't intimidate and the operators couldn't buy. They came armed not with guns, but with subpoenas, and they began to do something no one in Harlan had dared to do for years. They began to listen. The forgotten clue wasn't a single object, it was the collective memory of the people. One by one, miners, their wives, and their children came forward to testify. Each story, on its own, had been just a whisper of pain. But now, under the protection of federal marshals, the whispers became a roar. They spoke of beatings on dark roads, of cars dynamited, of the murder of Bennett Music, a 15-year-old boy. The committee chambers, hundreds of miles away, filled with the ghosts of Harlan's decade of suffering. But the clue that finally broke the back of the beast wasn't a memory. It was a number on a ledger. The committee's investigators got their hands on the financial records of the Harlan County Coal Operators Association. And there it was, in cold, hard print, a secret slush fund. They found cancelled checks and accounting entries that proved beyond any doubt that the operators were directly paying the salaries of hundreds of Sheriff Blair's deputies. The gun thugs terrorizing the county weren't public servants. They were a private army, funded by corporate interests. Suddenly, the whole dark picture snapped into focus. This wasn't just a case of a brutal sheriff abusing his power. It was a conspiracy. The law in Harlan County hadn't just been broken, it had been bought and paid for. This financial record was the key, the undeniable proof that turned whispers into evidence and paved the way for the unmasking of the entire rotten system. The La Follette Committee's investigation acted like a slow, inexorable sunrise over the dark mountains of Harlan. For years, the world had seen only the shadows, the gun thugs, the ambushes, the terror. Now, as the light of federal scrutiny grew brighter, the long, distorted shadows were traced back to the men who cast them. The ledger, that simple book of numbers, was the key that unlocked the entire conspiracy. The moment of revelation was at hand, and it was more chilling than any single act of violence. The true perpetrator of the Harlan County War was not a single man hiding in the hills with a rifle. It wasn't a radical agitator with a bomb. The true mastermind was a collective, an entity with a clean collar and a respectable name: the Harlan County Coal Operators Association. The ledger exposed them with brutal, undeniable clarity. There, in neat columns, were the payments, thousands of dollars flowing directly from the association's accounts into a special fund controlled by Sheriff J.H. Blair. The law in Harlan County wasn't an institution. It was a line item on a corporate expense report. And their motive? It wasn't personal hatred or political ideology or even a twisted sense of justice. It was something far colder, far more mundane, and infinitely more terrifying: profit. The motive was greed, distilled to its purest and most violent form. A union contract meant paying livable wages, investing in mine safety, and giving up the feudal control they held over their workforce. It was cheaper to hire killers. The beatings, the evictions, the dynamite, the midnight raids, it was all just the cost of doing business. It was a simple, brutal equation where a miner's life was worth less than the cost of a union contract. This single damning revelation unmasked the entire decade of terror. Sheriff J.H. Blair was not a rogue lawman. He was the highly effective, well-paid manager of the association's security forces. His deputies were not peacekeepers. They were mercenaries on a corporate payroll. The violence wasn't random chaos. It was a calculated, systematic campaign of intimidation designed to protect profits at any human cost. The web of terror that had seemed so tangled and confusing was, in fact, devastatingly simple. It was a privately funded war waged by the rich against the poor. The unmasking was complete. The smoke of the Battle of Evarts finally cleared to reveal the true enemy, and they weren't wearing a miner's dusty overalls or a deputy's badge. They were wearing business suits and sitting on the boards of coal companies. They had turned an entire county into their personal fiefdom and had purchased the law itself to serve as their private army. The gun wasn't in the hand of one man, but in the ink of the men who signed the checks. Now that we know the truth, let's go back. Let's stand in the shadows of those mountains and watch the tragedy unfold, not as a mystery, but as the execution of a plan. The terror in Harlan County began not with the roar of a gun, but with the quiet scratch of a pen on a checkbook in a smoke-filled office. It was decided, with the cold arithmetic of greed, that it was cheaper to pay for violence than to pay a living wage. A ledger became a rifle, and an accountant's entry became an ambush. Picture again that dusty road near Evarts. The convoy of company cars rolls into the narrow pass, full of men who believe the law is on their side because they carry the sheriff's badge. They don't know that their lives are just a down payment. Then, from the hillside, comes a single crack, sharp and clear, echoing off the rock faces. And in its echo, a hellstorm erupts. The air fills with the deep, stuttering bark of Thompson submachine guns and the sharp, scattered retort of hunting rifles. For 15 minutes, the pass is a vortex of smoke, splintered glass, and the deafening noise of a community tearing itself apart. Then, as suddenly as it began, there is silence. A silence made heavy by the sight of stalled cars, shattered windows, and still forms lying in the road. Imagine being a child in a company shack, trying to sleep. The only sound is the crickets and the wind in the pines. Then, another sound. The low rumble of a car coming slowly up the holler, a car that doesn't belong. Your mother's hand is suddenly on your shoulder, pulling you from the bed to the floorboards. You lie there, heart hammering against your ribs, smelling the damp earth beneath the house. A moment later, the night explodes. The window shatters inward, and the wall next to your bed splinters as a shotgun blast tears through the thin wood. The car speeds away, its taillights vanishing into the darkness, leaving behind the tinkle of falling glass, your mother's whispered prayers, and a fear that will never, ever leave you. The roads themselves became weapons. A union man driving home to his family would see a pair of headlights appear in his rearview mirror, growing closer, pinning him in their glare. He would grip the wheel, his knuckles white, his mind racing. Was it just a neighbor, or was it them? Every curve in the road was a potential trap. Every dark stretch of woods a place to be run off into a ditch. The county, once a home, had become a hunting ground, and the journey from the mine to your front porch was the most dangerous part of the day. And then there was the ultimate act of this calculated terror. A union organizer, Marshall Music, is driving with his family. The road ahead is clear. For a moment, it might feel like a normal day, but then the world is ripped apart by a deafening roar. The force of the blast throws the car from the road, twisting it into a barely recognizable shape of steel and smoke. In that single horrific instant, a journey is ended. A family is shattered. A 15-year-old boy's life is extinguished, not in a moment of passion or rage, but as a consequence of a line item in a corporate budget titled "Strike Expenses." This was the war in Harlan. It wasn't a fight between two equal sides. It was a systematic campaign of terror, planned in boardrooms and executed by men who had sold their badges and their souls. Every scream in the night, every bullet hole in a cabin wall, every newly dug grave was a direct result of a choice made by men in suits who likely never set foot in a mine. The true horror of Bloody Harlan is not just what happened, but the chilling, deliberate reason why. When the trials finally began, they were not held in the small, compromised courthouse in Harlan. The case had been elevated to the federal level, and the coal operators and Sheriff Blair, men who were once kings in their own domain, were now defendants in a United States court. The atmosphere was electric. Miners who had once hidden from Blair's thugs now sat in the witness stand, protected by federal marshals, their faces illuminated by the flashbulbs of a curious national press. For the first time, the quiet, fearful whispers of the hollers were being entered into the official record, spoken aloud for the whole world to hear. The defendants, the powerful men of the Coal Operators Association, and their chief enforcer, J.H. Blair, sat at their tables with an air of defiant indignation. They were not accustomed to being questioned. In their eyes, this was a political circus, a witch hunt orchestrated by Roosevelt's New Deal to break the rightful power of industry. Their high-priced lawyers spun tales of defending private property against a violent, communist-inspired insurrection. They portrayed Blair not as a tyrant, but as a heroic lawman standing against anarchy. But their narrative began to crumble under the weight of the testimony. One by one, miners and their wives took the stand. With simple, halting words, they painted a devastating mural of the decade of terror. They spoke of night riding, of beatings, of houses riddled with buckshot, of the constant, gnawing fear. They presented the ledger, the cold, hard proof of a conspiracy. The trial became a battle of two realities, the operator's world of contracts and legal rights, and the miner's world of blood and survival. And yet, in a stunning blow to the government and the miners, the first trial in 1938 ended in a hung jury. The operators' immense influence, their deep connections, and their ability to cast doubt had proven just strong enough. For a moment, it seemed as if the wall of power was unbreakable. The operators walked out of the courtroom, not convicted, their smirks a final insult to the men and women who had dared to speak against them. It was a moment of profound injustice, an echo of the crooked law they had mastered for so long. But the verdict in the court of public opinion had already been delivered. The La Follette Committee's investigation and the national press coverage had exposed the rot in Harlan County to the entire nation. The operators had escaped a conviction, but they had not escaped the shame. Facing the certainty of a second, even more grueling federal trial, and with their public reputation in tatters, they finally understood that their private war was over. In 1939, after nearly a decade of bloodshed, the Harlan County Coal Operators Association did what no amount of violence could force them to do. They surrendered. They signed a contract with the United Mine Workers of America. There were no jail sentences for the masterminds, no hangman's noose for the architects of the terror. The justice served wasn't the clean, righteous verdict the miners had hoped for, but it was a victory nonetheless, won not by a gavel, but by sheer, bloody-minded endurance. The ink on the union contract was barely dry, but the war had already left ghosts that would walk the hollers for generations. For the miners and their families, the victory was real, but it was not clean. They had won a measure of dignity, a livable wage, and the right to stand together, but the cost was etched into their very souls. A piece of paper couldn't bring back a murdered son, heal the memory of a shotgun blast through a bedroom wall, or erase the years spent living in the shadow of a gun thug's menace. The men who survived the mines and the picket lines carried the war home with them. It showed in the haunted look in their eyes, in the way they taught their children to distrust any man in a suit, any car that slowed down on a dark road. The fear, once it gets into the bones, doesn't leave. It's passed down, a bitter inheritance. Sheriff J.H. Blair and the coal operators who had funded his reign of terror never saw the inside of a prison cell. They returned to their comfortable lives, their power diminished, but their freedom intact. They had lost the war, but they had escaped justice. Blair faded from public life, but he never faded from memory. His name became a new kind of ghost, a bogeyman used by parents to frighten their children into behaving, a curse whispered in the corners of union halls for the next 50 years. The families of the deputies and gun thugs, many of whom were just local men trying to earn a paycheck, found themselves on the wrong side of a line that would never be erased. Their children grew up bearing names associated with betrayal and violence, forever marked by the choices their fathers had made. The war redrew the map of Harlan County. The lines weren't on any piece of paper. They were lines of loyalty and betrayal that ran straight through families, churches, and neighborhoods. The neighbor who had put on a deputy's badge was never fully trusted again. The store owner who had sided with the company found his business mysteriously dwindling. Friendships that had endured for a lifetime were shattered by the simple, brutal question of which side you were on. The children of union men and the children of company men went to the same schools, but they carried with them a silent, inherited animosity. Harlan County was no longer just a place. It was a memory of a war, and everyone who lived there was a veteran, whether they had carried a gun or not. Their lives were forever defined not by the peace that followed, but by the battle they had been forced to endure. You might think this war is over, a faded chapter in a history book, but you would be wrong. The story of Bloody Harlan is not history. It is a living memory etched into the very landscape of the county. Go there today and stand in that narrow pass near Evarts. When a coal truck rumbles by, the sound still echoes off the hillsides like the ghosts of machine gun fire. The road has been paved, but the place itself remembers. It is a scar on the land that will never fully heal. The tangible remnants are still there if you know where to look. They say that in some of the older brick buildings in town, you can still find the patched-over pockmarks left by stray bullets from forgotten shootouts. Walk through the old hillside cemeteries, and you'll find the tombstones of the men who fell on both sides, their names carved in stone, their stories now reduced to a pair of dates. These silent stone witnesses are the most honest memorials to the conflict, a quiet testament to the price that was paid. But the most powerful echo of Bloody Harlan isn't made of stone or steel. It's a song. That night, when Florence Reese, a hungry and terrified union man's wife, tore a page from a calendar and scribbled down the words to "Which side are you on?" she created something more powerful than dynamite. That song escaped the mountains. It became the anthem for the oppressed everywhere, sung on picket lines from Detroit to London, chanted in the streets during the civil rights movement, and translated into dozens of languages. A simple question, born of desperation in a Kentucky shack, became a global call to arms for justice. And the stories themselves are a living remnant. Sit on a porch with the old-timers, the grandsons and granddaughters of the men who fought, and they will tell you. They will tell you about the night the gun thugs came, stories passed down like family heirlooms. They'll tell you that the deep-seated distrust of outsiders and authority isn't paranoia. It's a lesson learned in blood. The world moves on, calendars change, but in Harlan County, the past is never truly past. It breathes in the mountain air, a constant whispering reminder that you must always be ready to answer that one simple question. And so we return to where we began, to that simple, haunting question, born of terror and hunger. Which side are you on? For a decade, the war in Harlan County was the answer. It wasn't a dispute over wages. It was a bloody 10-year war fought to decide if a man's life was worth more than a ton of coal. It was a war to determine if the law belonged to the people or if it could be bought and sold like any other commodity on the open market. This is a story not just of a crime, but of a conspiracy written in a ledger book. It's a chilling reminder of what happens when corporate greed is given a badge and a gun, when human lives are reduced to columns of profit and loss. But it is also a fierce testament to the enduring power of the human spirit when pushed to the absolute edge. The coal operators had the money, the guns, and the law. But the miners had something more powerful. They had their solidarity. And they had a song that turned their suffering into a shield, and their defiance into an anthem that would outlive all the men who tried to silence them. The guns in Harlan County are silent now. The picket lines are gone. But the story remains, a warning carried on the mountain wind. It reminds us that there are moments in history when there are no neutrals, when silence itself is a choice. And now, my friends, you know the story of Bloody Harlan, a story written in coal dust and paid for in blood that still asks every single one of us, which side are you on? In the stunned silence that followed the storm of gunfire, the people of Huntington, West Virginia, were left with a grim spectacle on their courthouse lawn, the body of a dead stranger. He was a man who didn't belong, a ghost from the bloody plains of Missouri, laid low in the heart of Appalachia. His death wasn't an answer. It was a question mark written in blood on the town's doorstep. How did the most infamous outlaws in American history, the James Younger gang, end up so far from home, leaving one of their own dead in a desperate, bullet-riddled retreat? Today, we will answer that question and unravel a story of Appalachian grit colliding with legendary evil. To understand the shock of that day, you have to understand the world that was shattered. Huntington, in 1875, was not some quiet mountain hollow lost to time. It was a city with a swagger, a raw and muscular town born from coal dust, steel rails, and ambition. Forged just a few years earlier by the railroad magnate Collis P. Huntington, it was the proud western terminus of the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway. It was a place where the ancient rhythm of the mountains met the thunder of the locomotive, a boom town humming with the promise of a new industrial Appalachia. At the very heart of this vibrant new world, on the corner of 3rd Avenue and 9th Street, stood the Bank of Huntington. It was more than just a building of brick and mortar. It was the town's beating heart. Through its doors flowed the lifeblood of the region, massive C&O payrolls for the railroad men, the hard-earned wages of miners who clawed wealth from the deep hills, and the fortunes of the industrialists who were taming the wilderness. This bank wasn't just holding money, it was holding the collected dreams and sweat of an entire community. The guardian of this trust was a man named Robert T. Oney, the bank's cashier. He was a man of ledgers and ink, of quiet respectability and steady habits. His world was one of predictable order, of days measured by the familiar clicks of the telegraph and the comforting clang of the vault door swinging shut. That afternoon, his son was with him in the bank, learning the family trade, surrounded by the symbols of security and civilization. For them, the world was a safe and logical place. Outside the bank's windows, the town bustled with activity, a testament to its newfound importance. But beyond the last paved street, the ancient Appalachian hills rose up, dense and watchful. These were the old mountains, the ones that had seen empires come and go, their hollows filled with secrets and shadows. They formed a stark contrast to the noisy, forward-looking city at their feet, a wilderness that could swallow men whole, a perfect landscape for both escape and ambush. But progress is a double-edged sword. The very thing that made Huntington a beacon of prosperity also made it a target. The same steel rails that carried coal out also carried stories in. Tales of the C&O payrolls, of the fat new bank on the Ohio River, traveled west on telegraph wires and in the talk of rail riders. These whispers reached the ears of men who saw progress not as an opportunity to build, but as a chance to take. Unseen and unheard, a shadow was stretching from the Missouri plains, drawn eastward by the irresistible scent of a prize that was simply too rich to ignore. On the sweltering afternoon of September 6, 1875, the first clue that something was wrong arrived on horseback. 8 strangers, cloaked in long, dust-colored coats that seemed oddly heavy for the heat, rode into town. They moved not like weary travelers, but with a chilling purpose, their eyes scanning the streets with a predator's focus. There was a disciplined silence about them that felt more menacing than any drunken shouting. For the citizens of Huntington, they were an unnerving puzzle, a whisper of trouble on the wind. The puzzle quickly turned into a portrait of terror. 4 of the riders dismounted in front of the Bank of Huntington. As one stood guard at the door, a sentinel of violence, the other 3 stepped inside, their heavy boots echoing on the floor. Within moments, the routine calm of Robert Oney's afternoon was obliterated. A $5 bill was offered for change, a simple transaction that became the trigger for a nightmare. As the cash drawer opened, a Colt revolver appeared, massive and unarguable. The outlaw's voice was calm, almost conversational, which made his words even more terrifying. "We are the James boys. We have come for the money." The scene inside was one of cold, professional plunder. While Oney and his son were held frozen under the barrel of a gun, the other men moved with a terrifying efficiency, vaulting the counter and stuffing bags with the town's wealth. The scene spoke not of a desperate smash and grab, but of a rehearsed, military-style operation. The outlaws knew exactly what they wanted, from the loose cash to the contents of the new, modern vault. Outside, the other 4 horsemen turned 3rd Avenue into a shooting gallery. They galloped back and forth, firing their pistols into the air, their shouts echoing off the brick buildings. This wasn't random chaos. It was calculated terror, designed to paralyze the town and suppress any resistance before it could begin. For those first few minutes, the street was a bewildering landscape of noise, smoke, and fear. The crime scene wasn't a static place of discovery. It was a living, breathing storm of violence. The questions came in a panicked rush. Who were these men? Why were they here? Was this the end of their town? The wilderness wasn't in the surrounding hills. It had ridden right into the heart of Huntington, and it offered no easy answers, only the immediate deafening report of a dozen 6 guns. In the days that followed the raid, as the story was pieced together from 100 terrified accounts, the first and most obvious suspect was not a single man, but a ghost. It was the ghost of the Confederacy, a phantom born from the raw, unhealed wound of the Civil War. You see, this wasn't just a bank robbery. To many people, especially those with Southern sympathies, this was a calculated act of war. a personal vendetta waged against a symbol of northern power and occupation. The motive was as clear as a mountain spring to anyone who had lived through the conflict. The Bank of Huntington was the financial heart of the C&O Railway, a Yankee enterprise carving up the ancient hills and imposing a new order on the land. To a man who had lost his home, his kin, and his cause fighting for the South, that bank wasn't just a building full of money. It was a monument to his defeat. Robbing it wasn't simple theft. It was a righteous blow against the conqueror, a desperate attempt to reclaim a sliver of lost honor and pride. Whispers quickly turned to the methods of the crime itself. The initial evidence was in the execution, the cool discipline, the expert horsemanship, the terrifying efficiency. This wasn't the work of common thieves or local hotheads. This was the cold arithmetic of combat, the tactics of seasoned cavalrymen who had learned their trade in the brutal guerrilla warfare of the border states. Locals who had fought in the war recognized the style immediately. It was the same ruthless precision used by the partisan Rangers who had terrorized Missouri and Kansas. It wasn't long before a name was put to this ghost: Jesse James. The name was already legend, spread by dime novels and sensationalist newspapers. He was cast as the avenging angel of the lost cause, a man who had never surrendered. His history as one of Quantrill's most fearsome raiders was well known. The story fit perfectly. The raid on Huntington was seen as a natural chapter in his ongoing war against the banks, railroads, and authorities that represented the Union. For many, the case was closed before it had even been properly opened. The perpetrators were the James Younger gang, and their motive was vengeance. But as the dust settled and the adrenaline faded, a more unsettling question began to snake its way through the back rooms and taverns of Huntington. Was it really that simple? The James Younger gang were ghosts from another world, strangers in this rugged Appalachian terrain. How did they know the exact day the C&O payroll would be in the bank? How did they navigate the town with such confidence? And more importantly, how did they know the perfect escape route? A direct line into the tangled wilderness of Wayne County, where a posse would be useless. The cold, horrifying answer began to form. They couldn't have known. Not on their own. Suspicion began to fall not on a man with a gun, but on a man with a pen, an insider, someone within the C&O Railway or even the Bank of Huntington itself. This suspect had no public feud or bloody history. He was a trusted face, perhaps a quiet clerk who saw the river of money flowing past his desk while his own share was but a trickle. Or maybe a telegraph operator, a man who translated the secret clicks and dashes that detailed the movement of fortunes he could never hope to possess. This man saw the wealth of the railroad barons firsthand and felt the bitter sting of his own small place in their grand design. His motive wasn't vengeance for a lost cause. It was the timeless, ugly engine of greed and resentment. He was a man who felt cheated by the very system he served. He saw the easy money waiting in the vault and saw the outlaws from Missouri as a tool, a violent key to unlock a future he felt he was owed. Providing them with a map, a schedule, and the layout of the bank would have been his ticket out of a life of quiet desperation. When re-examined through this lens, the outlaw's actions took on a darker shade. Jesse James's supposed inspection of the new vault wasn't just bravado. It was the remark of a man who had been told to expect it. The gang's immediate and unerring flight to the 9th Street Bridge was no longer a lucky guess, but the execution of a pre-planned route. This theory was terrifying because it meant the enemy wasn't just an external force that had stormed the town. It suggested that a Judas had been living among them all along, a man who had sold his neighbor's safety for a bag of stolen silver. The betrayal, hidden behind a trusted face, felt far more sinister than the open violence of the raid itself. There was, however, a third theory, one that was whispered in the boardrooms and telegraph offices far from the dusty streets of Huntington. This theory suggested the crime wasn't born of Southern pride or an insider's greed, but was a cold, calculated move in a much larger, more brutal war. It was a war fought not with cannons, but with contracts, spies, and when necessary, hired guns. This theory posited that the James Younger gang were not the masterminds, but merely the bloody instrument of a powerful external force. The target, in this version of events, wasn't just the money in the vault. The real target was Collis P. Huntington himself and his burgeoning C&O empire. In the cutthroat world of 19th century railroad expansion, rivals like the Baltimore and Ohio were locked in a ruthless struggle for territory and resources. Huntington's success as the C&O's western hub was a direct threat to their interests. What better way to cripple a competitor than to strike at his proudest achievement? A brazen, violent robbery would send a clear message. Huntington is not safe. The C&O cannot protect its own assets. Your investments, your payrolls, your very lives are at risk in this lawless Appalachian outpost. In this scenario, the James gang becomes a scalpel in the hands of a surgeon dressed in a three-piece suit. Someone with deep pockets and a complete lack of scruples could have easily sent a pathfinder like Bill Chadwell to Missouri with an offer. A handsome fee to sow chaos, plus whatever they could carry out of the bank. This would explain the gang's incredible gamble in traveling so far into unfamiliar territory. It wasn't a whim, it was a contract. They were mercenaries hired for an act of corporate terrorism. Looking back, some locals remembered unsettling signs in the months leading up to the raid. They recalled strangers in fine city clothes, men who didn't belong in the rough-and-tumble town, asking pointed questions about railroad shipping times, land values, and the bank's security. At the time, they were dismissed as investors or surveyors. But in the bloody aftermath, their presence took on a sinister new meaning. They were the scouts for an economic predator, the advance guard for an attack designed not just to empty a vault, but to shatter the confidence of an entire city and derail the ambitions of a railroad king. In the minutes after the gang thundered across the 9th Street Bridge, Huntington's shock curdled into pure, unadulterated rage. A posse, a mix of grim-faced lawmen and ordinary citizens turned avengers, plunged into the tangled wilderness of Wayne County. They were fueled by a righteous fury, certain that a swift and bloody justice could be found just around the next bend of the Guyandotte River. They followed the fresh tracks, believing the outlaws' brazenness was matched only by their foolishness for choosing such a difficult escape. Their greatest hope was the wounded rider, the one who had slumped in his saddle. A man that badly hurt couldn't go far, they reasoned. He would slow the others down, leave a trail. They scoured the forest floor for a speck of blood on a leaf, a hastily discarded bandage, any sign of a man faltering. But they found nothing. The tracks led them deeper into a labyrinth of creeks and hollows, a green, suffocating world that seemed designed to hide fugitives. The trail grew cold, the hoofprints scattered and vanished. It was as if the forest itself had conspired with the outlaws, swallowing them whole. Frustrated, the posse turned its attention to the theory of an insider. Suspicion fell on any known Southern sympathizers living in the rugged hills between Huntington and Kentucky. Men who had ridden with the Confederacy were rousted from their farms, their homes searched, their families questioned. But this tactic backfired spectacularly. They were met not with confessions, but with a wall of stony silence. These mountain folk, already distrustful of authority, closed ranks. Every question was answered with a shrug, a blank stare, or a muttered, "I saw nothing." Instead of uncovering a conspiracy, the posse only managed to sow deeper resentment, chasing shadows while the real culprits slipped further away. Days later, they straggled back into town, their horses lame and their spirits broken. They returned not with prisoners in tow, but with the bitter taste of failure in their mouths, their clothes torn by briars and their faces etched with exhaustion. The only proof the gang had ever been there was the body of Tom McDaniels, a silent, decomposing trophy that offered no answers. The initial blaze of heroic defiance had died down, leaving behind the cold embers of fear and the growing, terrible realization that the most dangerous men in America had come to their town, bled their streets, and simply vanished. The posse's failure in the hills of Wayne County was about more than just rough terrain. It was a collision with an invisible, impenetrable fortress. It was a confrontation with the ancient mountain code, an unwritten law far more powerful than any statute passed in a distant state capital. As the lawmen pushed deeper into the hollows, they found that people's eyes grew guarded and their doors closed a little tighter. Men who would normally share a story and a dipper of water suddenly had nothing to say. Women would call their children inside and the world would go quiet. This wasn't simple ignorance. It was a deliberate collective act of forgetting. To understand it, you have to understand the soul of Appalachia. This was a land settled by people who had come to escape authority, be it from kings across the ocean or tax collectors from the flatlands. Here, loyalty was not to a government, but to blood, to kin, and to your neighbor. You didn't talk to the law because the law had never done a thing for you, except maybe try to take your land or your moonshine. Justice was a private matter, handled with a handshake or, if necessary, a shotgun. The fear of retribution was a palpable thing, as thick as the morning fog in the valleys. Everyone knew what happened to those who talked. A fence might be cut in the dead of night, letting the livestock wander off. A prize hog might turn up sick. A barn, the very symbol of a family's livelihood, could go up in flames from a single well-placed lantern. These weren't idle threats. They were the grim language of mountain politics. Helping the law against men like the James Gang, men who, to some, were still seen as Confederate heroes, was seen as the ultimate betrayal. It was choosing the side of the outsider against your own, and so the wall of silence held firm. A farmer might have seen 8 riders pass his gate, their horses lathered and one man slumped low. A woman drawing water from her well might have heard the desperate gallop and seen them disappear up a hidden creek bed. But when the sheriff came asking, they saw nothing. They heard nothing. They knew nothing. Their silence was a shield, protecting them not only from the outlaws' revenge, but also from the intrusive world that lay beyond their ridgelines. The truth of the Huntington heist was lost somewhere in that silence, buried deep in the unmappable country of a community's fear. For years, the story of the Huntington heist remained frozen in time, a brutal but unresolved chapter in the town's history. The outlaws had vanished, the money was gone, and the wall of silence in the hills had proven unbreakable. The official investigation withered on the vine, leaving only folklore and speculation. But the truth, as it often does, was lying dormant, waiting for an accidental turn of a key. The turning point didn't come from a sheriff's investigation or a lucky posse, but from a place far away, a consequence of the gang's own arrogance. 1 year later, in September of 1876, the James Younger gang rode into Northfield, Minnesota, expecting another easy conquest. Instead, they rode into a buzzsaw. The townspeople fought back with a ferocity that dwarfed even Huntington's resistance. When the gun smoke cleared, Bill Chadwell and Clell Miller were dead in the street, and the Younger brothers were captured, grievously wounded. The invincible aura of the gang was shattered forever. It was in the aftermath of this disaster that the forgotten clue from Huntington finally resurfaced, not as an object, but as a confession. Held in a Minnesota jail, facing a lifetime of hard labor, Cole Younger began to talk. He spoke of the gang's history, their motives, and their methods. When questioned about the audacious raid so far to the east, he confirmed the long-held suspicion. He admitted that the gang had indeed robbed the bank in Huntington, West Virginia. He spoke of the fierce street fight and the desperate flight into the mountains. Most importantly, he gave a name to the man who lay in a pauper's grave on the courthouse lawn, Tom McDaniels, a trusted member of their deadly fraternity. This confession was like a lightning strike in the dark. It traveled back to Huntington on telegraph wires, a voice from a Minnesota prison cell that finally broke the Appalachian silence. It wasn't a hidden map or a dusty journal. It was the unvarnished truth from the mouth of one of the perpetrators. It transformed the dead outlaw from a nameless stranger into a specific villain. It validated the stories of the townspeople who had fought back and confirmed that they had faced down the most legendary criminals of their age. The confession didn't recover the stolen money or reveal any local conspirators, but it provided something just as valuable: certainty. The ghost that had haunted Huntington for a year finally had a face. For a full year, the identity of the Huntington Raiders had been a ghost story, a legend told with a mix of fear and a strange, grudging respect. The name Jesse James was on everyone's lips, but it was a name spoken like a folktale character, a boogeyman from a distant land. There was no proof, only the chilling style of the crime and the whispers that followed. The town was left in a state of suspended animation, knowing they had been violated, but unable to officially point a finger at the specters who had ridden through their streets. The unmasking, when it came, was not a sudden discovery, but a cold, hard confirmation that the legend was terrifyingly real. The news from the Minnesota jailhouse swept through Huntington like a cleansing fire. Cole Younger's confession was the final, irrefutable piece of the puzzle. The ghosts were finally dragged from the realm of myth and into the harsh light of reality. They were not phantoms. They were men of flesh and blood, now with names that could be written in a ledger of crime. The dead outlaw on the courthouse lawn was no longer an anonymous casualty. He was Tom McDaniels. The wounded rider who vanished into the hills was, as many had suspected, Cole Younger himself. And the cold-eyed leaders who had calmly announced their intentions in the bank were none other than Jesse and Frank James. The full roster of the culprits was now known, a rogues gallery of the most wanted men in America. Jesse James, the charismatic leader, his brother Frank, the quiet killer, the formidable Cole Younger, the hardened veterans Clell Miller and Bill Chadwell, and the ill-fated Tom McDaniels. They were the core of the gang, a brotherhood forged in the guerrilla wars of Missouri, and they had brought their private war to the doorstep of Appalachia. And what was their definitive motive? Was it a noble act of Confederate defiance, as the dime novels claimed? Was it a complex plot of corporate sabotage? The confession, stripped of all romance, laid the truth bare. The motive was far more primal and far less glamorous. It was money. By 1875, the James Younger gang were no longer soldiers fighting a lost cause. They were professional thieves. Their past as Confederate partisans had given them their skills, their ruthlessness, and a convenient moral justification for their crimes. But their war was over. Their business had begun. The C&O payroll and the bank's deep vaults were simply the largest, most tempting prize they had heard of in years. The raid on Huntington was a strategic business decision. They were drawn east, not by ideology, but by the scent of a fortune. The polite manners, the supposed Robin Hood persona, it was all a carefully crafted myth, a public relations campaign for a gang of killers. The unmasking revealed that beneath the legend of the Southern Avenger was the cold, simple heart of a predator. Huntington was not a symbol to be defied. It was a treasure chest to be cracked open by any means necessary. The afternoon air inside the Bank of Huntington was thick with the lazy heat of late summer, smelling of paper and brass polish. That peace was shattered by the thud of heavy boots. As Robert Oney looked up, the world tilted. The man across the counter offered a $5 bill, but his eyes were cold, holding no warmth of commerce. As Oney's hand went to the cash drawer, the outlaw's hand went to his coat. There was a soft whisper of leather, and then the massive dark eye of a Colt revolver was staring at him. The hammer being cocked was the loudest sound Oney had ever heard, a metallic click that sealed the moment in time. A calm voice cut through the silence, and the world of order and ledgers was gone, replaced by the simple, brutal law of the gun. Oney and his son could only watch, frozen in a state of primal fear. The raiders moved with a terrifying grace, a ballet of plunder. They vaulted the teller's cage as if it were a pasture fence, their long coats flaring. There was no fumbling, no hesitation. Their hands, accustomed to reins and triggers, swept stacks of currency and coins into canvas sacks with a rustling, clinking sound that was a sickening parody of a normal bank transaction. One of them paused to look at the new vault, the town's pride, and spoke a few words of mock admiration before emptying its contents. It was a performance of absolute dominance, designed to break not just the bank's locks, but the spirit of the men inside. Outside, the street had become a vision of hell. The four mounted outlaws were orchestrating a symphony of terror. They galloped from one end of the block to the other, a whirlwind of dust and menace. The air cracked and popped with the constant discharge of their pistols. It wasn't aimed fire. It was auditory violence, a deafening declaration of ownership of the street. Windows on the second floor of the St. James Hotel shattered, the tinkling of glass lost in the unending roar. For the people of Huntington, peering from behind curtains and doorways, it was a waking nightmare. Their town was no longer theirs. It was a stage, and they were the terrified audience to a terrifying show. But the paralysis of fear can only last so long before it hardens into rage. The outlaws' barrage was suddenly answered. The sharp crack of a squirrel rifle from a hardware store doorway joined the deeper boom of the Colts. A window flew open above the dry goods store, the glint of a shotgun barrel appearing for a second. The symphony of terror became a discordant duel. The air, already thick with smoke, grew hazy, a rolling fog of battle that obscured figures and turned the street into a landscape of lethal guesswork. The hunters had, in a shocking turn, become the hunted. As the gang burst from the bank's doors, their bags heavy with loot, they ran headlong into this new reality of organized resistance. They were no longer performers on a stage, but soldiers caught in an ambush. In the chaotic scramble for their horses, amidst the rolling cloud of gun smoke, one of the riders suddenly stiffened, a marionette whose strings had been cut. He pitched sideways from his saddle without a sound and fell, a dark, motionless shape against the bright dust of the street. His panicked horse, now riderless, bolted after the others. In that same hail of unseen lead, another rider lurched forward, grabbing the pommel of his saddle as if struck by a giant, invisible fist. His hat flew from his head, but his powerful frame clung to the horse, his body contorted in a silent struggle against an unseen force. He did not fall. The remaining outlaws dug their spurs into their mounts, their disciplined operation now a frantic, desperate flight. They thundered towards the 9th Street Bridge, a mad dash for the safety of the wilderness, leaving the echoes of their violence hanging in the air. When the last hoofbeat faded, a ringing silence descended upon the street. The smoke slowly drifted away on the afternoon breeze, revealing a scene of surreal stillness. Shattered glass glittered on the boardwalks, and there, in the middle of the street, lay the still form of Tom McDaniels, a final grim testament to the fact that on this day, the people of Huntington had fought back. In the aftermath of the raid, there was no grand trial in Huntington. There was no solemn judge, no jury of 12 peers, no eloquent lawyers arguing points of law. The only trial that ever mattered for the James Younger gang in West Virginia took place in a 90-second span of chaotic gunfire on 3rd Avenue. The jury was a hardware store owner with a rifle, a clerk with an old army pistol, and a dozen other anonymous citizens who decided that their town was worth defending. The verdict for Tom McDaniels was delivered not by a foreman, but from the barrel of a gun, a swift and final judgment that required no appeal. Instead of a courtroom, the town had the courthouse lawn. McDaniel's body was dragged there and put on display, becoming a gruesome pulpit from which the town preached a silent sermon of defiance. Crowds gathered to stare, their faces a mixture of grim satisfaction, morbid curiosity, and lingering fear. This was justice in its most raw and primal form, a public spectacle meant to reassure the community that an invader had been repelled and a price had been paid. A coroner's inquest was held, a brief formality that concluded, to no one's surprise, that the outlaw had died of justifiable homicide. He was then unceremoniously buried in a pauper's grave, his story in Huntington ending as it began, a nameless threat, now a nameless corpse. The real legal reckoning came a year later and hundreds of miles away in a Minnesota courthouse. It was there that the captured younger brothers faced a formal system of justice. There was no defiance in their demeanor, only a stoic, weary acceptance of their fate. Cole Younger, in particular, was calm and cooperative, his confession providing the final, authoritative chapter to the Huntington raid. They pleaded guilty to their crimes in Minnesota to avoid the spectacle of a trial and the near certainty of a hangman's noose. They were sentenced to life in prison, a verdict that was celebrated in the North as a triumph of law and order. But for the people of Huntington, it was a distant echo, a hollow victory. The Youngers were being punished for Northfield, not for the terror they had inflicted upon West Virginia. The money stolen from their bank was never recovered, and the two men most responsible, Jesse and Frank James, remained free, ghosts in the wind who had escaped Appalachian justice entirely. And so, the final verdict for the Huntington heist was a deeply unsatisfying one, an empty chair at the defendant's table. Jesse James would eventually be killed by a traitor in his own gang, and Frank would surrender and through legal maneuvering walk away a free man. No member of the James Younger gang was ever convicted or even formally charged for the crime committed in Huntington. The town had won the battle in the street, but the masterminds of the war had gotten away clean, a bitter injustice that still lingers in the hills, a story of a crime that was punished but never truly prosecuted. The gunsmoke over Huntington eventually cleared, but the lives it touched were never the same. The raid was a flash of lightning that left a permanent afterimage burned into the soul of the town and its people. For Huntington itself, the brutal afternoon became a defining moment. It was a scar that, over time, became a badge of honor. The city was no longer just a proud boomtown of the railroad. It was the town that had stood up to the James gang and drawn blood. The men who had grabbed their rifles and fought back became local legends, their stories told and retold until they became a part of the city's foundation myth, a testament to the fierce, self-reliant spirit of Appalachia. For Robert T. Oney, the cashier who stared down the barrel of that Colt revolver, life was cleaved in two, the quiet, orderly life before the raid and the rest of his days after. He had looked into the eyes of the most famous outlaws in America and survived. He carried that memory with him always, not as a source of fear, but as a quiet mark of resilience. He remained a respected figure in Huntington, a living link to that historic day, a man who had been at the very epicenter of the storm and had held his ground. But the fates of the outlaws were also irrevocably altered. You see, for the James Younger gang, the Huntington heist was a victory that planted the seeds of their destruction. It was here, in these Appalachian hills, that they first encountered a civilian population that was not easily cowed, one that would fight back with lethal fury. The death of Tom McDaniels and the serious wounding of Cole Younger were a shock to their system. They had won the money, but they had been bloodied and forced into a desperate, humiliating retreat. It was a dress rehearsal for their own funeral. 1 year later, emboldened by their success but failing to heed its warning, they would face that same citizen rage in Northfield, Minnesota, a fight that would shatter the gang forever. The cloud of suspicion about an internal betrayal eventually faded, but it left a lingering chill. The raid forced the community to look at itself, to wonder about the loyalties of their neighbors in a way they never had before. It strained the delicate trust that holds a town together, a wound that healed slowly over time. The raid became a shared trauma, and in surviving it together, Huntington forged a stronger, harder identity. And what of the masterminds? The James brothers, who had escaped West Virginia's justice, could not outrun their own violent destiny. Jesse James, the charismatic leader, would be shot in the back of the head years later by a coward in his own gang, killed for a reward. Frank James, the quiet brother, would eventually surrender and, through a series of controversial trials, live out his days as a farmer and a reluctant celebrity, a ghost from a bygone era of American violence. Their lives and the lives of everyone they touched that September day were forever intertwined, bound together by the echoes of gunfire on a Huntington street. If you stand on the corner of 3rd Avenue and 9th Street in Huntington today, you won't see the bank that the James gang robbed. That building is long gone, replaced by the glass and steel of the modern city. But while the bricks have vanished, the story has soaked into the very ground beneath your feet. The memory of that day doesn't live in a monument. It lives in the whispers that still drift through the Appalachian air. This is a story that has become a permanent part of the region's folklore. Ask an old-timer about it, and their eyes will light up. They'll tell you the enduring legend of Cole Younger, wounded and barely clinging to his horse. The tale goes that he was secretly taken in by a Confederate sympathizing doctor deep in the hills of Wayne County, nursed back to health in a hidden cabin while the posse searched fruitlessly. There's no hard proof, of course, but in these mountains, a good story holds its own kind of truth, a truth about loyalty and the old codes that never really die. And then there's the gold. Like a promise whispered on the wind, the legend of buried treasure persists. For over a century, people have believed that in their frantic escape, the gang was forced to bury a portion of their heavy loot somewhere in the tangled wilderness between Huntington and the Kentucky border. Treasure hunters, armed with folk tales and a stubborn hope, still comb the creek beds and scour the hillsides, searching for Jesse James's Appalachian gold. The most tangible trace of that day is a void. Somewhere in Huntington, in an unmarked pauper's grave, lies the dust of Tom McDaniels, a permanent silent resident from Missouri. And the bridge they crossed is gone, replaced by a modern span of concrete. But the real echo through time isn't made of stone or bone. It's the hollows and creek beds of Wayne County, the very landscape of the escape. The city's memory may fade with each new generation, but the mountains themselves hold the story, etched into their ancient, silent faces. They remember the thunder of hooves, and they've kept the secret of that desperate ride ever since. We began this story with a question mark written in blood on a courthouse lawn. How did the most feared outlaws in America end up so far from home, leaving one of their own dead in a West Virginia street? We know the answer now. They were drawn here not by the ghosts of the Confederacy, but by the simple, powerful magnet of greed. They came for the C&O Railroad's gold, believing their own legend would be enough to paralyze a town with fear. They misjudged their target. They expected to find timid sheep, and instead found a den of wolves. But the true lesson of the Huntington heist is not about the audacity of the James gang. It is about the ferocious courage of ordinary people. This is a story of how a young Appalachian city, barely 4 years old, refused to play the part of the victim. It's a story that proves that history isn't just written by famous men with guns. It's forged in the split-second decisions of nameless citizens who decide that enough is enough. The iron will of the men and women who carved a life from these mountains proved to be a far more formidable weapon than any outlaw's revolver. So the next time you hear the romantic tales of Jesse James, the Robin Hood of Missouri, remember the truth of what happened here. Remember the hardware store owner with his rifle, the cashier who refused to break, and the town that bled but did not bow. This is a story of how character is revealed by chaos, and how a community's soul can be forged in the crucible of 90 seconds of gunfire. It's a testament to the enduring, unshakable spirit of these hills. And now, my friends, you know the rest of the story, or at least as much of it as the mountains are willing to give up. The sound that first alerted the landlady wasn't a scream or a crash. It was the steady, unending hiss of a water tap left running for hours. Inside the bathroom of a modest New Jersey boarding house, a scene of quiet horror waited. A young woman, just 24 years old, lay submerged in the cold water of the tub, her head beneath the faucet. On a nearby chair, her clothes were folded with an almost chilling precision. A note sat on a small table, its shaky handwriting telling a story of despair and a life given up. To the world, it was a clear-cut tragedy. A troubled soul named O.C. Sneed had finally found a desperate peace. But for one man, the county physician who first examined the body, the scene wasn't one of tragedy, it was a stage. It was too neat, too perfect. And that raises the bone-chilling question we're here to answer today. If O.C. Sneed didn't write that note, who did? And if she didn't take her own life, who held her head beneath the water until it was over? Otelia Gilmer Sneed, known to all as Ose, was a ghost long before she died. She was the very picture of turn-of-the-century Southern beauty, delicate, with eyes that held a deep and searching sadness. For a brief, fleeting moment, she had a life of her own. She married a man she loved and gave birth to a daughter, a small flicker of warmth in what had been a cold and controlled existence. That little family was her world, her one chance at a life defined by her own choices and her own happiness. But O.C. was born into a dynasty in decay. Her mother, Caroline, and her two aunts, Virginia and Mary, were the last vestiges of a proud Virginia family whose fortunes had withered like autumn leaves. They lived on the edge of Appalachia, in a world where the memory of wealth was a heavier burden than poverty itself. They were women forged in the fires of Southern pride, a pride that could curdle into something monstrous when faced with the shame of destitution. They saw Oates's simple happiness not as a blessing, but as a betrayal of their ambitions. And so they began the slow, methodical work of dismantling her world. They were a trio of spiders, weaving a web of concern and manipulation around her. They convinced O.C. that her husband was unworthy, that motherhood was too great a strain for her delicate health. They pried her away from her husband, and then, most cruelly, from her own child. They moved her from city to city, a traveling invalid with no anchor and no friends, only her three ever-present caretakers. The true poison they fed her wasn't in a bottle, it was in their whispers. They told her she was sick, and so she was. They told her she was a burden, and so she became one. They told her she was fragile, and her spirit became as brittle as spun glass. They isolated her from anyone who might offer a kind word or a dissenting opinion, until their voices were the only ones she could hear. This was the world that was lost, not just the life of a 24-year-old woman, but the life she was never allowed to live. She was a prisoner in a gilded cage of family duty, a beautiful, gentle soul who was systematically broken down by the very women who should have protected her. The tragedy wasn't just what happened in that bathtub. It was the slow, deliberate murder of her spirit that had been going on for years. To the first officers on the scene, it looked like an open and shut case, a sad but simple story written in the objects left behind. The laudanum bottle, nearly empty, the drinking glass, and the note, the final desperate period on a life sentence of sorrow. The scene was a still life of despair, carefully arranged and presented. But it was that very care, that meticulous neatness, that began to unravel the whole story. Suicide is an act of chaos, a final violent tearing of the soul. This was something else entirely. It was clean, it was orderly, it was a performance. Dr. William Mackenzie, the county physician, was a man who understood death. He'd seen it in all its forms, violent, peaceful, accidental, and self-inflicted. And as he stood in that cold, damp bathroom, his professional instincts were screaming that this was wrong. He noted the position of O.C.'s body, the lack of any real disarray. He looked at the neatly folded clothes on the chair. Who folds their clothes before drowning themselves? It was a small detail, but it was a crack in the story, a tiny fissure through which a horrifying truth would begin to seep. The true wilderness in this case wasn't a forest of trees, but a wilderness of lies. The clues weren't tracks in the mud, but inconsistencies in human behavior. The two elderly aunts, Virginia and Mary, were putting on a symphony of sorrow that somehow rang false. Their wails seemed rehearsed, their grief too theatrical for the quiet, grim reality of the room. Dr. Mackenzie watched them, and the cold knot of suspicion in his gut tightened. He sensed he was not in the presence of mourners, but of actors who had just finished their final scene. The bathroom offered no easy answers. Instead, it presented a series of unsettling questions. Why was the scene so pristine? Why did the women's grief feel so hollow? And most importantly, as doctor, Mackenzie looked at the shaky, uncertain script of the suicide note. He couldn't shake the feeling that O.C. Sneed was not the author of her own death. The room was silent now, the water turned off, but for the doctor, the air was thick with whispers of a crime too monstrous to yet be named. In any story like this, the first shadow of suspicion always falls on the husband. And O.C. Sneed had a husband, a man she had once loved, the father of her child, a man who had been systematically and surgically cut out of her life by her family. He was the outsider, the one person who stood to gain nothing from her death, but everything from her life. Yet in the twisted logic of a murder investigation, this made him the perfect first suspect. The story the family told was a compelling one. They painted a picture of a rough, unsuitable man, someone who wasn't worthy of their Virginian aristocracy. They had, in their telling, rescued Otzi from a disastrous marriage. They were protecting her. But the lawmen had to wonder, what does a man do when his wife and child are stolen from him? Does he walk away? Or does a deep and poisonous bitterness begin to take root in his soul? The motive was as old as the mountains themselves, a heart turned to stone by jealousy and rejection. The whispers would have started immediately. He couldn't have her, so he made sure no one else could either. Perhaps he had been trying to get her back, and in a final desperate confrontation, his rage had boiled over. It was a simple, brutal explanation that made a certain kind of sense. He was the spurned lover, the classic villain in a tale of love gone wrong. Investigators would have looked into him, searching for any sign of instability, any threat he might have made. Every letter he sent, every desperate plea to see his own daughter would now be re-examined through a sinister lens. Was it the plea of a loving father, or the obsession of a stalker? The family's wall of silence would have ensured that every memory of him was tainted, every action twisted into something menacing. He was the easy answer, the convenient scapegoat whose presence allowed everyone to avoid looking at the far more unthinkable possibility waiting in the shadows. But the husband was a ghost, a convenient shadow to chase while the real danger sat knitting in the parlor. The most chilling twists in any story come not from an enemy at the gate, but from a traitor at the table. And in Otzi Sneed's life, the table was surrounded by her own blood. No one would ever suspect the very women who had sworn to protect her. Her mother, Caroline, her quiet aunt, Mary, and the undeniable center of their dark little universe, her other aunt, Virginia Wardlaw. Virginia was a woman carved from granite. A former headmistress of a prestigious school, she carried herself with an imperious authority that bent others to her will. She wasn't just the matriarch of the family, she was its absolute monarch. To be in her presence was to feel a quiet, terrifying gravity, a force that pulled you into her orbit and held you there. She was a woman of formidable intelligence, but her mind had turned inward, consumed by a single, poisonous obsession. The secret motive wasn't a crime of passion. It was the cold, chilling arithmetic of greed. The family's pride was all they had left, and it was a poor substitute for the wealth they'd lost. Osi, in their eyes, was not a daughter or a niece. She was an asset, a walking, breathing vessel to be converted into cash. Over months, they had taken out more than a dozen life insurance policies on her, a web of future payments totaling over $32,000. In 1909, that wasn't just a fortune, it was a resurrection. It was the price of their beautiful, fragile Osei, and a price they were more than willing to pay. Suddenly, every act of care they had shown her was cast in a sinister new light. Separating her from her husband wasn't protection, it was isolating the asset. Moving her from town to town wasn't for her health, it was to keep her away from prying eyes. Their constant whispers that she was sick and tired of living weren't words of comfort. They were psychological warfare, preparing the ground for the suicide they were planning. Their grief, which had seemed so theatrical to the doctor, was now revealed for what it was: the final, triumphant act of a play they had been writing for years. But there was a third player in this tragedy, a silent partner whose motives were not born of passion or family pride, but of cold, impersonal commerce. This threat didn't come from the shadowed hollows of Virginia, but from the gleaming office buildings of the North. It was the burgeoning, rapacious world of the life insurance industry. In the early 1900s, this was a new and powerful game in America, a system that allowed you to place a wager on a human life and, for the right price, profit from its end. This was not a single man in a city suit, but an army of them. Eager agents, hungry for commissions, who saw these three refined Southern ladies not as potential killers, but as a respectable source of income. They likely never questioned why this family was so keen on insuring their frail, sickly niece. They never raised an eyebrow as one policy was stacked upon another, and then another, until Osei Sneed's life was worth a king's ransom. Why would they? The premiums were being paid, and that's all that mattered. This external force provided the ultimate impersonal motive. To the insurance companies, Osei was not a woman with hopes and a lost child. She was Policy 74B, a name on a ledger, a set of actuarial tables, a risk to be calculated. The system itself, in its relentless pursuit of profit, created the very weapon the family needed. It transformed Osei from a human being into a financial instrument, an investment waiting to mature. This corporate entity created a climate of deadly opportunity. It gave Virginia Wardlaw the tools and the incentive to turn her dark thoughts into a workable plan. The insurance men didn't hold Osei's head under the water, and they bore her no ill will. But their contracts, signed and sealed with a fountain pen, were the death warrant. They were the faceless, unknowing accomplices who built the gallows, handed over the rope, and then turned a blind eye, content to simply count their money. The law, my friends, tends to move in straight lines, and the straightest line of suspicion pointed directly at Osei's estranged husband. In the days following the discovery, the telegram wires began to hum with his name. Here was a man with a clear, understandable motive: the rage of a spurned husband and a father denied his child. A posse, either literal or figurative, was sent to track him down. They expected to find a monster consumed by rage. Instead, they found a man hollowed out by loss. The promising trail evaporated into a puff of cold Appalachian air. Osei's husband was hundreds of miles away, his presence confirmed by a dozen clock-punching factory workers who saw him every single day. His alibi wasn't just firm, it was ironclad. When questioned, his grief was raw and undeniable. The letters he'd sent, once viewed as the obsessive rantings of a potential killer, were now revealed for what they were: the desperate, heartbroken pleas of a man trying to claw his way back to the family that had been stolen from him. The lead wasn't just cold, it was a dead end that led to another victim of the family's cruelty. With their primary suspect cleared, the investigators in New Jersey hit a wall. They were left with the unsettling scene in the bathroom and three grieving women. But how do you accuse a mother and her sisters of such an unspeakable act? Virginia, Caroline, and Mary presented a united front of Southern gentility and profound sorrow. Their story was simple and, on the surface, unshakable. Osei was a troubled soul, and her fragile mind had finally broken. Who could prove otherwise? The investigation stalled. The days turned into weeks. The initial shock in the community began to curdle into a low-grade fear. The easy answer, the vengeful husband, was gone. Now, a more terrifying question hung in the air. If he didn't do it, who did? The authorities were frustrated, circling a truth they couldn't grasp. They had a strong suspicion, a gut feeling that the evil they were looking for was right in front of them, hiding behind black mourning veils, but they had no proof. The case was growing colder by the day, threatening to become just another sad, unsolved tragedy. The investigators soon discovered that the most formidable obstacle they faced wasn't the lack of evidence, but the suspects themselves. The community in this case wasn't a town or a holler. It was a closed, suffocating circle of 3 women. The Sneed and Wardlaw sisters had built a fortress around their secret, and its walls were mortared with Southern pride and a deep, ingrained contempt for the prying questions of outsiders. This wasn't the code of silence of the mountains where neighbors protect their own. This was the omerta of the family, a pact sealed in blood and greed. At the center of this wall was Virginia Wardlaw. Her iron will was the law that governed her sisters. Caroline, Osie's own mother, and the quieter Mary moved in her shadow, their thoughts and actions seemingly extensions of Virginia's own. To question one was to question them all, and to question them was to be met with a performance of wounded dignity and sorrow so convincing it was almost a work of art. They were a united front of black lace and quiet denial, a living embodiment of the Southern creed to never air one's dirty laundry in public, especially not for the benefit of Northern lawmen. Their silence was rooted in a profound arrogance. They believed they were intellectually and socially superior to the policemen and reporters who hounded them. The investigation, in their eyes, wasn't a righteous search for truth. It was a vulgar intrusion. They answered questions with condescending patience, as if explaining complex matters to a simple child. Every inquiry about Otes's life was met with a polished story of a tragic, depressive girl. Every query about their own actions was deflected with a sigh of grief. The psychological toll of this siege was immense, but it only seemed to harden their resolve. Interrogating them was like trying to punch through granite with your bare hands. There were no cracks, no whispers, no single moment of weakness. One sister's story perfectly mirrored the others. The pressure built, but the wall held firm. This steadfast, unified front created a profound fear in the investigation itself. The fear that these women, protected by their class, their gender, and their own unshakable will, might actually get away with it. They were hiding in plain sight, and their silence was the most damning evidence of all. The case, which had gone cold, was not broken open by a single dramatic discovery. There was no hidden diary, no deathbed confession. Instead, the truth was unearthed by a new kind of detective, the kind Virginia Wardlaw and her sisters had never accounted for, the insurance investigator. These were not men bound by the niceties of police work. They were bulldogs, hired to protect their company's money, and they followed the scent of fraud with a relentless, single-minded determination. While the police were hitting the wall of the family's silence, these investigators were working in the opposite direction. They started not with the body in the tub, but with the paper trail. They descended on the case like a flock of crows, pulling records, interviewing agents, and piecing together the web of policies the family had spun around Otse. What they found was staggering. It wasn't just 1 or 2 policies, but more than a dozen. A financial net so vast and so recently woven that it screamed of a premeditated plan. The turning point came when they uncovered the timing. They found that in the weeks leading up to Otes's death, the sisters had been in a frantic race against time. Some of the premiums were overdue. The policies, worth a small fortune, were on the verge of lapsing. The investigators found evidence of desperate letters, of money being scraped together, of a panicked effort to keep their investment alive. It was the crucial detail that changed everything. Otes's death wasn't just a convenience. It had become a necessity, a deadline that had to be met before the whole scheme collapsed. But the final forgotten clue was found not in a ledger, but on a druggist's shelf. An investigator, working on a hunch, canvassed the pharmacies in the towns the women had passed through. And he found him, a small-town druggist who remembered a strange purchase. A tall, stern-looking woman, a woman who matched Virginia Wardlaw's description perfectly, had come in just days before the death. She'd bought a bottle of chloroform, claiming it was for a sick cat. Suddenly, the official story of a laudanum suicide crumbled to dust. A new, far more horrifying picture began to form. A picture of a young woman not just drowned, but first subdued, rendered helpless before being placed in her own watery grave. The truth was no longer a suspicion. It had a name and it smelled of chloroform. With the discovery of the chloroform purchase and the frantic, desperate attempts to keep the insurance policies active, the story of Otzi Sneed's sad suicide was no longer just a lie. It was an insult to the truth. The net, woven from paper trails and a druggist's memory, had been thrown. Now it was being pulled tight, and there were only 3 people caught within its threads. The investigators were no longer asking if a crime had been committed. They were looking at the 3 women in black and asking a much more terrifying question: which one of you held her down? The unmasking began with the undeniable architect of the entire affair, Virginia Wardlaw. She was the sun around which her sister's weaker wills orbited. It was her stern, imperious face the druggist remembered. It was her sharp, calculating mind that had conceived of the insurance scheme, first tested on her own nephew Fletcher, and now perfected on her niece. The motive was born of her pride, her refusal to accept a life of genteel poverty. In the family's fall from grace, she saw not misfortune, but a personal failure that had to be rectified by any means necessary. Otzi was simply the final, most valuable means. But Virginia, for all her strength, did not act alone. She needed accomplices, and she found them in her own blood. Her sister, Mary Sneed, quieter and more pliable, followed her lead without question. But the most monstrous betrayal came from Caroline Martin, Otzi's own mother. This was the dark heart of the conspiracy. Caroline, a woman who seemed cold and detached, had made a horrific choice. She had sided with her powerful sister against her own child, sacrificing her daughter on the altar of her family's financial salvation. She was not a mother watching a tragedy unfold. She was a willing participant, a silent partner in what the sensationalist press would soon call the bathtub trust. And so, the true motive was laid bare, and it was far colder and more brutal than any crime of passion. It wasn't mercy, it wasn't madness, it was an act of accounting. They had convinced themselves that their right to a comfortable life superseded Otzi's right to live at all. They were drowning in debt and shame, and Otzi was a life raft they could only use by killing her. The love, the care, the concern, it was all a ghastly performance, a long and patient grooming of their victim for the final slaughter. The mask was off. Beneath the veils of southern gentility and grieving motherhood lay the faces of killers. They weren't monsters who had crept in from the wilderness. They were the monsters who had lived inside the house all along. The central mystery was solved. Otzi Sneed was murdered by her mother and her aunts, a conspiracy of 3 women bound by blood, who committed the ultimate sacrilege for $32,000. The plan, rehearsed for weeks in whispers and cold glances, was now set in motion. In the confines of that small boarding house room, the air grew thick with a terrible purpose. A handkerchief was produced, its clean white fabric belying the dark intent. The sickly sweet odor of chloroform filled the air, a chemical scent that promised not a gentle sleep, but a deep and final oblivion. Otzi's faint pleas, already weakened by years of psychological torment, faded into a confused murmur, then silence. There was no longer any resistance, only the dead weight of a life already surrendered. 2 sets of shadows moved as one. The sound of her body meeting the cold, hard porcelain of the empty tub was a dull, final punctuation mark in the quiet room. Then, a hand, perhaps the very hand that had once rocked her cradle, reached out with unnatural steadiness and twisted the silver faucet. The shriek of the pipes and the sudden roar of rushing water was a deafening sound, a sound meant to wash away everything. For a moment, there was a brief, violent disturbance on the surface of the rising water. A frantic splash, a single desperate gasp for air that was immediately swallowed by the deluge. And then, as quickly as it began, it was over. The splashing stopped. The only sound left was the steady, indifferent hiss of the water pouring over a stillness it had just created. Her dark hair began to spread out around her head like a tragic halo in the ever-deepening pool. The women watched, their faces unreadable stone, until the surface was calm and glassy. This was not an act of rage, it was a task to be completed. With a chilling efficiency, they turned their attention to the stagecraft. They placed the forged note just so. They arranged the laudanum bottle and the glass, and with methodical care, one of them folded Osie's clothes and placed them neatly on a chair, the final sociopathic touch on their masterpiece of murder. With the evidence mounting, the veneer of Southern respectability shattered like cheap glass. Virginia Wardlaw and Caroline Martin were arrested, their black mourning dresses replaced by the coarse fabric of prison uniforms. The trial became a national sensation. Newspaper reporters from across the country descended on the small New Jersey town, eager to document every detail of the bathtub trust. The courtroom was packed every day with a morbidly curious public, all craning their necks to get a look at the mother and aunt accused of a crime that defied comprehension. Caroline Martin, Osie's mother, seemed to shrink in the witness box. Her lawyers argued that she was not a monster, but a victim herself, a woman completely under the hypnotic spell of her domineering older sister. They painted a picture of a weak will eroded by a stronger one, claiming she was insane, incapable of distinguishing right from wrong under Virginia's powerful influence. Some in the courtroom pitied her. Others saw a coward trying to escape the consequences of her own terrible choices. But Virginia Wardlaw was a different matter entirely. Even in her jail cell, her indomitable will refused to be broken by others. She would author her own ending. Realizing the game was over and the full, sordid truth of their years of scheming was about to be laid bare for the world to see, she chose the final act of control. With a small, sharp pen, the same kind of instrument she might have once used to grade school papers, she wrote out a full confession. It was a masterpiece of manipulation, taking sole blame, exonerating her sisters, and framing the murder as a mercy killing for a girl who was tired of living. Then, with a surgeon's precision, she severed an artery in her arm and bled to death on the cold stone floor of her cell. Virginia's suicide note was her last, defiant move on the chessboard, and it worked. It cast enough doubt to save her sisters from the gallows. Caroline Martin was found guilty, but her plea of insanity was accepted. She was sentenced not to prison, but to 7 years in the New Jersey State Hospital for the insane. Mary Sneed, the quiet third sister, was also declared insane and institutionalized. Justice, in the end, was a murky affair. The mastermind was dead by her own hand, and her accomplices were hidden away from the world in asylums, leaving a verdict that felt profoundly unfinished, a story that still echoes with the injustice of it all. The ripples from that cold New Jersey bathtub spread far and wide, altering the course of every life the water had touched. For Osie's husband and her young daughter, the verdict was not a victory, but the beginning of a long, quiet haunting. He was a man vindicated, cleared of all suspicion, but his reputation in some circles remained unfairly stained. He was left to raise a daughter who would never know her mother, a child whose inheritance was not money, but a legacy of horror, a bedtime story too terrible to ever tell. They disappeared from the public record, seeking the anonymity that had been stolen from them, forever defined by a tragedy they had no part in creating. The families of the guilty were likewise shattered. The proud Wardlaw and Sneed names, once synonymous with Virginian aristocracy, were now whispered with a shudder, forever linked to a monstrous crime. Descendants for generations to come would carry the weight of what their forebears had done. They bore a silent shame, a darkness in their family tree that could never be pruned away. They lived with the knowledge that the blood of both a victim and her killers flowed through their own veins. And what of the women in the asylum? For Caroline Martin, the mother who sold her daughter's life, the state hospital became her tomb. She died there just a few years later, in 1913, her claims of insanity perhaps becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy in the grim reality of institutional life. Did she ever feel remorse? Did she see her daughter's face in the long, lonely nights? The asylum walls kept her secrets. Mary Sneed, the quiet accomplice, faded even deeper into obscurity, a footnote in her sister's grand, evil design, living out her days in the shadow of a crime that had consumed them all. The fortune they had killed for was eaten up by legal fees and clawed back by the insurance companies. In the end, their great scheme earned them nothing but death, madness, and infamy. If you travel to the old cemeteries of Lynchburg, Virginia, you can still find the stones that mark the end of this story. There, under the shade of ancient magnolias, lies the grave of O.C. Sneed. And not far away, you will find the final resting places of her mother and her aunts. They are all there together, a family united in death as they were in life, a silent, chilling tableau of victim and killers sharing the same sacred ground. The physical evidence of this tragedy has not vanished. It is carved in granite, a permanent record for anyone who knows where to look. But the story doesn't just live in stone, it breathes in the folklore of the region. For years after the trial, the people of Lynchburg spoke of the Wardlaws and the Sneeds in hushed tones, as if saying the name too loudly might invite the same darkness into their own homes. They spoke of a curse, a poison that ran through the family's bloodline. The convenient suicides of Colonel Sneed and O.C.'s brother Fletcher, followed by O.C.'s murder and Virginia's own final, violent act. It was too much to be a coincidence. It was the story of a doomed house, a family that was destined to consume itself. To explain the unthinkable, to understand how a mother could participate in the destruction of her own daughter, the most powerful legend of all was born, the myth of Virginia Wardlaw, the hypnotist. People whispered that her will was more than just strong. It was a supernatural force. They said she could bend people to her will with a glance, that her sisters were not truly accomplices, but puppets dancing on her invisible strings. It was a story that painted Virginia not just as a murderer, but as a sorceress of the mind, a Svengali in a Sunday dress. And of course, where there is great tragedy, there are always ghosts. Legends began to circulate of a weeping woman heard near the site of the old New Jersey boarding house. And back in the Lynchburg cemeteries, people claimed to see a sad, spectral figure in a white dress wandering among the tombstones on moonless nights. The lost soul of O.C. Sneed, forever trapped by her family's evil, unable to find peace even in the grave. These tales, passed down through generations, are the scar tissue left on the memory of a community that was forced to look into the face of an unimaginable evil. We began this story in a cold bathroom, with a still body in a tub and a simple, terrible question. If O.C. Sneed didn't take her own life, who did? We now have our answer, and it is more horrifying than any fiction. The hands that held her head beneath the water were not those of a stranger or a spurned lover or a faceless villain. They belonged to her mother and her aunts. The plot to end her life was not hatched in a dark alley, but in the parlors and boarding house rooms where they feigned love and affection. The story of O.C. Sneed is not just a tale of a forgotten crime. It is a chilling lesson on the nature of greed. It shows us how the desperate hunger for money and status can become a kind of poison, a sickness that rots a family from the inside out until it is capable of devouring its own. It's a brutal reminder that the most respectable exteriors, the southern manners, the church-going piety, the black mourning dresses, can hide a heart of pure, cold stone. But the ultimate moral of this story is about the perversion of trust. Osi was taught her entire life to obey her family, to trust in their wisdom, to believe in their love. That trust was the weapon they used against her. They turned the sacred bond between a mother and a child into a tool for manipulation and murder. This is the story's final, enduring horror, the realization that the greatest danger doesn't always come from the darkness outside, but from the smiling faces we are taught to love unconditionally. And now, my friends, you know the rest of the story. It stands as a testament to the fact that monsters are real, and sometimes they're the ones who tuck you into bed at night. For 3 days in the summer of 1889, the town of Hazard, Kentucky, was a war zone. The courthouse wasn't a place of law, but a brick fortress under siege. An army of nearly 100 men, led by a hired killer known only as Bad Tom Smith, had come to take the town by force, and the streets echoed with the constant crack of Winchester rifles. The newspapers called it the bloody end of a clan feud over money and power. But the old-timers in these mountains knew the truth was deeper, rooted in honor, betrayal, and a code of justice written in blood. Today, we're going to separate the gun smoke from the legend. We'll find out how a political dispute exploded into open warfare, and how one man's death on the gallows marked the end of an entire era in Appalachia. Before the bullets flew, Hazard, Kentucky, was a world unto itself, nestled deep in the rugged heart of Perry County. This wasn't a peaceful mountain hollow, it was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The hills were rich with timber and the black promise of coal, and the man who controlled the town controlled that wealth. Here, power wasn't held by a mayor in a starched collar. Power was the sheriff who was your kin, the judge who owed you a favor, and a rifle that never missed its mark. The air was thick with the tension of a storm that had been gathering for years. On one side stood the French clan. They were the old guard of Appalachia, people whose roots ran as deep as the ancient oaks. They lived and breathed the unwritten laws of the mountains. Honor was more valuable than gold. An insult to your family was an act of war, and you settled your debts yourself, blood for blood. Led by Joseph C. French, they saw Perry County as their birthright, a sacred trust passed down through generations. To them, the coming of new laws and outside money felt like an invasion. Challenging them were the Eversoles and their powerful allies, the Combs family. They were the new force, more ambitious, more connected to the changing world beyond the mountains. Their unofficial leader, Josiah Combs, was a shrewd politician who saw a future paved with railroads and fueled by coal money. They believed